You're listening to the We Are Libertarians Network. Find more great shows like this at wearelibertarians.com. Welcome to We Are Libertarians. This is a continuation in our series called The Swamp Explained. This is where I talk to Rob Quartel, a 45-year fly on the wall in Washington, D.C. Rob has worked for Republican presidential campaigns, government agencies like the EPA, and has been confirmed by the Senate to the U.S. Federal Maritime Commission. You'll often see him talking about the Jones Act on the Cato Institute. He's also been a candidate for Congress and Senate. He's also spent years working in the private technology sector with startup companies. And given his experience and iconoclastic viewpoints, Rob gives us a great insight into the swamp that makes up our nation's capital. This is often the most celebrated series of We Are Libertarians. Rob, I frequently get, like, you'd think, okay, well, libertarians talking about the swamp and, you know, you're no anarchist. You think, oh, well, this audience will go, oh, this is just all statism. But I get so many kind comments going, you know, I love Rob's perspective. I think this is such a great show. So, you know, we've been doing this for almost 2 years. Several, probably 15
sort of
episodes.
randomly, right?
Yep. We try to get together every couple weeks, and but yeah, we've got a nice little 15, 16 episode. There's a special feed if you want to go catch up and listen to everything. Rob's got some great stories and great insights on things. And the goal here is really to kind of talk about the news and explain the swamp a little bit and try to understand how Washington works, because how can you change something if you don't understand it? But thanks for being here, Rob. I appreciate it.
Yep, totally.
Just wanted to share those well wishes with you.
Yeah, well, we should tell all those people to send it to 5 other people after this episode and get us some more viewers and ask them to do the same, or listeners.
Let me tell you that the period between Labor Day and Christmas in a presidential election year is the growth period for any political podcast. And then you plateau for 4 years. So if you love this show, the only thing that works is you sharing it with friends personally or on your social media and recommending the show. So please do that. Well, we had a whole show planned out. We've been really good about coordinating, and you've been sending topics, and we've been looking at things, and then everything blew up last night at 8:30. Ruth Bader-Ginsburg passed away. She was 87. She's been on the court, I believe, nominated by Clinton, and an icon in women's rights and opening up avenues to women. I mean, in the early days of her career, she couldn't get a job at a law firm, you know, let alone thinking she could be a Supreme Court justice.
Well, and she applied. She applied for a clerkship at the Supreme Court too, as I understand it, and got turned down. So
really,
great irony there. Yeah.
What was she? I'm blanking on it, but she was involved in some major women's rights campaign, and I was surprised.
Well, she was involved in a number of them. And what was interesting about Ginsburg was that, and you know, I'm not an expert on her or the law, but I certainly have followed it, and I loved our RPG, you know, our BG, the Ruth Bader Ginsburg movie, and she was just and by the way, Trump today actually acted like a normal human being yesterday and said, well, he was surprised and she was a great woman. And even if you disagreed with her, and I thought, well, gee, that was like uncharacteristically statesmanlike. Of course, he's probably gleeful, which we can talk about in a minute, about the political consequences.
Our bar is so low for this guy that when he says a moderately decent platitude about somebody, we go, oh, thank goodness he's being decent.
God, he's being decent. But she had a really interesting theory of a lot of things, but she didn't go full frontal assault on all of the discrimination against women, and that's what she was known for. She took it bit by bit, and she sort of nibbled away at pieces of it and made the absurdity of the differences and the consequences. She connected the absurdity and the consequences really well, and she, of course, is very critical in deciding labor law around women and equal wage, equal pay for equal work and things like that. She also had her philosophy about that also extended to abortion, which I have always thought was interesting. And wherever you stand, and I certainly support choice as a conservative. I support choice. I don't know how you cannot and call yourself conservative. her view on the Roe v. Wade was that it was decided without consensus. Basically, she made the point that on gay marriage, society was ahead of the court, and she felt that on abortion, the court was ahead of society. And in a democracy, that really is what it's all about. Madison's Metronome, this great book about his view of political science and discourse, is that the metronome is that instrument that tick tock over the piano that helps you get your rhythm correct. And he basically said democracy was like that. You have these swings until you find a rhythm and a place in the middle that everybody can accept. This is the way things should go. And gay marriage was decided, and it's not an issue except within a minute number of people, whereas abortion rights continue to be an issue across society. And
the argument is basically that because it was forced, it created a backlash that continues.
Not so much forced,
later.
But that it happened without kind of the standard paces of democracy. And again, If you're a conservative, you're not opposed to change. You support institutions and growth of the way we think about it. You support public policy that evolves and that it doesn't jerk randomly from one side to the other. So I, for one, would hate to see any of that reverse, and they've been trying to nibble around it for years. But I just thought philosophically that was a very good illustration of how she viewed the law. And so she was really significant. And I thought John Roberts' statement today was really terrific. I'm paraphrasing, but that she really was an icon of history in her own right. And all the Supreme Court judges will all be, by and large, their names will go down in history, but she will be someone who stands tall in history that people remember for her contributions. So, but she is, she knew what her thing was. She wanted to live to the next president. And during the Obama administration, they actually tried to push her out. Or let me rephrase that. There were people who were said to have wanted to push her out so that he could appoint a judge in a similar political
I've seen some anger on the left at her for not conceding to that on Twitter this week.
But you don't see much of that today. I think it is sad. And, she also was quite tenacious, and as she fought cancer the way she fought everything. And as she herself said, she was a great illustration of the American dream. It was, she said, how long did it take to go from being a clerk to a Supreme Court justice? And she said 1 generation. Her mother was an accounting clerk, a clerk, basically. And here she was a Supreme Court justice. And I really agree with that. I think she was an exceptional individual.
And that's really what makes America special in the system is allowing, people from humble means to rise to places of prominence and in fairly short order, as opposed to generations of nobility where it's in a caste system like England or India. It's a quick jump here. Yeah.
Well, she also said, and I think this is true a lot, that she was very lucky in her choice of a life partner. Her husband was Marty Ginsburg was, by all accounts, and I have a number of friends who knew him, and I certainly have met her on occasion and him, but and he died, not actually so long ago, probably in the last 5 or 6 years, but they met when he was 18 and she was 17, and he was an absolute feminist, although he might not have called himself that. He really believed that women should be able to do anything women wanted to do and anything that men did or could do, and he was very supportive. And he was also apparently a terrific cook. And my friends who knew them well as a couple have always talked about how terrific he was and creative and supportive. And he was, of course, very accomplished in his own right as a lawyer and business person. And but we should all be so lucky. And, I personally feel the same thing. My wife and I have been married 39 years, and we've both been very supportive over time. And you hope that everybody has that kind of experience. Not everybody does, and sometimes you got to make 1 or 2 or 3 tries at it, but till you get it perfect or imperfectly, whatever. And I love the comment she was quoted on the other day. It was saying her mother gave her 2 pieces of advice, the best one of which was, sometimes you just have to be a little deaf. And she said, in marriage, and she hard of hearing. And she said that was true in marriage. And frankly, it was true in everything she'd ever done, including in the courtroom and on the Supreme Court, which I thought was great. And,
that's one thing that stands out is, and this is a feature of the swamp versus the Trumpism, the willingness to fight on every, the world we're in now is the extreme sides want to fight on everything. And the thing that I've noticed is, you listen to these swampy podcasts like The Hacks or something from the Bulwark, or, you get a sense of, we'll illustrate it with RGB, with Ruth Bader-Ginsburg's life. Great friends with Antonin Scalia. You saw this when he passed away, riding elephants, getting along, arguing with each other. And her mode of operation was essentially, I'm not going to get angry. I'm going to look at the long term. I'm going to pick my fights where I can. I'm going to be strategic about it. I'm going to be principled and work through the system to change. And no, it may not be fast, but it will get done eventually. But I'm not going to give into that anger and that quick burst. And that seems to be such a feature, especially in the legal community. When people talk about the swamp or the establishment, so many of them are lawyers. And debating and arguing and process are such a part of that mindset, and I find myself attracted to that because it seems so much more of a better way to work things through. Something like I mentioned, the Confederate statues.
Yeah,
it feels good to get a mob together and go pull down that statue, but by having the hearing and going through the Democratic Republican process of standing around and going, This group gets to be heard out. This group gets to be part of this. Everybody, and you may lose, but at the end of the day, that statue will come down, and everybody will feel heard, and that tension is dispersed, as opposed to just creating the resentment over a mob taking something down. And that's
well, and I think and I think, Chris, some of that is, I think a person like Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Scalia and so many others like that, there's both a personal aspect to your relationships. There is a sort of a tactical aspect, if you will, and then that is sort of comes into the long-term strategic aspect. So Ginsburg, in her cases and what she did, she would lay down a marker and take a little bit here, and then be able to use that again as 3 steps forward and 1 step back, kind of in her legal cases, and that's really true of a lot of stuff. Of course, your point about so you should be able to talk to people who are totally different. And Biden has some of these issues among the Black Lives Matter people and others, because he actually admitted that he had cordial relationships with some of the Southern senators and Strom Thurmond and some of these others who were out and out racists. Although, even Thurmond had a little bit of a realization at some point, maybe it was political, but it that he needed black voters. And so, but now we can get into the whole conversation about what can be excused and what can't. But the reality is we just, everyone is imperfect, and they are certainly imperfect in politics. You think about how many people cancel out their spouse's vote and still manage to get along. So, and actually, it leads me to this. So I was thinking about Biden and all of that, but it also leads me to think a little bit about the upcoming election night and all that. And there are a lot of topics I'd like to get to, but there are already people talking about what if he loses and doesn't leave, and when will we know, and all of that. And I am only reminded of 2 events, certainly in my lifetime, where one could have called foul, and one was Kennedy-Nixon. And when the results out of Cook County came in late enough to change the state of Illinois, which gave the election to Kennedy, And Nixon felt strongly that there was clear evidence that there had been cheating, but he basically, with all his faults, chose to accept the results. And he wrote about it later and others, and it was true that he felt that, you have to let the democratic process play out, and some things just aren't perfect.
Upholding the system was part of why he stepped down and resigned as president.
That's right, absolutely. And then you have Gore v. Bush, W, the same thing. And Gore's, I heard Gore's statement yesterday, heard him talking about that again, and I thought, well, that is in the tradition that you just alluded to, and so who knows what will happen? But everybody's lining up at the barricades.
Yeah, my advice to listeners, and we're going to do some shows on this because the attack on the vote. So I ran a Senate campaign against Dan Coates, and I know I've met him a couple times. I know many people who've worked for him when he was a senator. Both times he was a senator. I've never heard anything bad about Dan Coates from here in Indiana. And, Dan Coates was the director of national intelligence, which means he sat in meetings that I will never sit in. And the guy just knows more than I do. And so when he writes an article in the New York Times, an op-ed saying the country cannot recover from delegitimizing the election, the most chilling thing I thought in 2016 was when Donald Trump kind of hinted he wouldn't accept the results of the election. Now, lo and behold, Hillary Clinton never did either, and look at where we're at.
That's right. That's right.
You introduce that seed of your vote doesn't count, and all of a sudden the entire system starts to crumble, and you go to a very scary place historically when you look back at history. But what I try to tell people is, Go find out how you signed your name on your voter registration. That's what I've been a part of 2 recounts, and what you will see in this election, if it is close, specifically in Florida, where there's 2,500 lawyers on standby, 700 in Texas, according to James Carville, is you get 2 teams of lawyers fighting over a single ballot. And if you didn't cross the T on your name, they go, well, they didn't intend to vote for this person. This is not a real ballot. This is fraudulent. Like 25% of them get thrown out because the signatures look like wildly different. But the fights come down to, several dozen ballots in some cases, like in Minnesota or here in Indianapolis, and the ones where they're fighting over the signatures. So how you sign your name in these swing states really makes a big difference. And I don't. When Bill Maher floated the idea that Trump wouldn't leave or that Trump wouldn't accept a loss, everybody laughed at him. And I was like, why are we laughing? Because that's a perfectly logical. I think either side are so primed to go, this isn't a legitimate election. Or if you get this Supreme Court nominee through in 50 days, this isn't a real Supreme Court. Kavanaugh should be impeached. This person. I guess the question of legitimacy is never something that I've seen questioned in my lifetime. I don't know if it has been in yours. You tell me. But once you start questioning the legitimacy, you start to descend into chaos pretty quickly. And it's not a good place to be. I
think there have certainly been periods in history where that was very true. And if you go back certainly into the early decades of the Republic, you see a lot of really scurrilous personal charges, and also charges of illegitimacy, not only of illegitimate children, which they frequently did, but of illegitimacy as a process. And of course, you also had battles over, in the extension of states, should these people be allowed to vote? And in those cases, white male people. Was it too soon? Which actually was an interesting mirror of the process between the American colonies and the British public, so I think history absolutely repeats itself, and I don't know if this is worse than any period of time. It is certainly fraught, and you're right. There will be a lot of questioning, and you are exactly right about Clinton. I absolutely don't believe the Clinton people have ever accepted this as a legitimate election, and unlike Gore. And
Gore literally said no more recounts. I'm just going to concede for the good of the country.
Right. And Nixon essentially said the same thing. And Hillary just could not do it because she couldn't believe it that many people. And the country is split. It is really 40 something for Trump and 40 something for Biden, and 10 or 12 in the middle, and how they allocate or whether they turn out is really going to be the big issue. So anyway,
have you seen the Bloomberg report that the Republicans are going to vote on Election Day, conservative-leaning people will vote on Election Day, and that day Trump will be the president, but then 4 to 5 days after, the absentees will all get counted, and then Biden will be the eventual winner?
Yes, and there's some interesting data. There's a New York Times article from the last week, and you and I have talked about maybe posting some of this on the website, and I'll make sure you get it and we can post it. But there was an article last week looking at the primaries in these states during the COVID period, and in fact, there is absolutely that. You see this spike of you see the first leap on Election Day of voters, and then you see the votes trickle in, and sometimes it's 5 days, and sometimes it's 9 days, and sometimes it's 3 weeks, depending on the state and their experience with this. So the states that have had absentee or voting by mail, some of the northwestern states do that, and they really don't have a ballot box per se. The ballot box is the mail. They have a lot of experience with it, so their processes are set up to do that. So. And this is particularly important in the 10 swing states. And it looks from the data to me that in their report that you'll really have, it will take, 4 or 5 days. And I do think the psychology of this is going to be very interesting in how the media handles it. They will have to very much make the point that with the vote counted so far, and 62% of the anticipated vote is being counted now, that kind of stuff. They're going to have to be really good at contextualizing. But I also think it's going to be very hard for them to project accurately. Now, we started voting in Virginia yesterday, and the lines were very long in a lot of parts of the state of the Commonwealth. And I expect that pretty much everywhere. And, I'm going to vote by mail, although I'm sitting here wondering where the hell my ballot is. I applied for it online about 3 weeks ago. And of course, I really believe everybody has to vote. And even, I'm just upfront with it. I'm a lifelong Republican, even though I don't think most of these people are anymore. And I can't bring myself to vote for a Democrat. But sure as hell, I'm not going to vote for Trump.
Yeah.
So I'm going to throw it. My wife accuses me of throwing my vote away, and I point out that Virginia is going to go for Biden anyway. But I'll tell you what, how he handles and how the Senate handles this issue of the nomination, of someone to replace Ginsburg, that's probably going to have an effect on my vote. And I think we started to talk about it's going to have massive galvanizing effect on everyone else. I think if Trump and these guys all in the Senate play games with this, as they're already doing, then it's going to make me think twice about pulling a lever for a Republican for the Senate.
Really?
And we've got a pretty decent candidate running here who he is running right to the center here, and he's Daniel Gade. He's a war veteran and lost a leg, and of course, I'm at this stage, I don't know anything about his record, and I'm going to go back and look at that, and I think everybody should. But in the absence of further knowledge, I'd probably do what I always have done, which is, unless I think somebody's a stinker, I'm going to probably stay down the party line because I work in the party. So
I think that's
right on a show like this.
Yeah, that's okay. That's an interesting point. At least you're honest about it. There's a lot of Trump and Libertarians clothings around that you're just like, just admit it.
Right.
But so, I hadn't thought about people delaying returning their absentee ballot to watch how this plays out.
Yeah,
and the psychology of people, like the donations for liberal groups and for McConnell's opponent and the DNC last night, I guess, were record-setting. And, the Trump has a way of taking a political opportunity and completely blowing it because of his impulsiveness. But he did he has shown discipline in a couple points. First was in 2016 after the Hollywood Access tape. Bannon and Conway sat on him and told him to be quiet, and he read off the teleprompter until Election Day, and that helped. The second was during the Kavanaugh hearings where he didn't tweet for almost a month. And McConnell now has his reelection tied to Trump, and McConnell is really responsible for the majority of Trump's big policy points.
Absolutely.
He's the last adult in the GOP that has control over Trump, and he may get the president to be quiet at the end of this race to move this through. But the reality is that, in my view, Trump's style of politics is to inflame, and the right was never more galvanized than during the Kavanaugh fight because they were able – the media and the left can't help themselves. They're going to nominate someone as soon as possible to get the media and the left to start picking at that, doing the Cory Booker routine with the eyes flaring and calling this person evil. And so then Trump can just play diplomat and go, do you want them in charge? There was never
you did a good thing. That's pretty good there.
You need me to protect you for them. That's why
your hair's not long enough or orange enough.
Right. He will pick somebody like Amy Coney Barrett who's doesn't have anything in her record that's probably terrible. She's probably nice. She'll be on TV, and these Democrats will be screaming at this like woman, and the Republicans will just go, look at him. And I think that could have a massive effect.
The issue right now with Biden is they're trying to force him to publish his own list of who he would consider, and Trump just doubled his list, last week.
Yeah.
And of course, he doesn't know who any of these people are, what their philosophy is. It's the society basically certified them and sent it over to him. And I think probably if I were Biden, I would probably publish a list. And of course, he's trapped by, I got to have a black woman kind of thing. And if he's smart about it, he will publish a list that's inclusive of a lot of people, but and then get people talking about the quality. And if he's also intelligent, they won't be crazies either. They'd be more like Merrick Garland was, which is right down the center left as a judge.
How about that? How about McConnell's flip? What's your take on McConnell's flip?
He's purely tactical. I mean, now he's saying that never in history has Senate of the opposite party let's see. When he did it with Obama, it was never in history has the Senate of the opposite party confirmed a nominee so close to an election. Of course, there were only like one or two other instances in all of American history. So it was be kind of hard for him to, that was sort of one of those three implied Pinocchios, kind of little white lies. And of course, now he's on the other side of that. And I think the interesting one's going to be who sits it out. So Lindsey Graham is in charge of the Judiciary Committee, and Lindsey was very categorical 2 years ago, and they're playing that over and over, saying that he would not support confirming a justice close to an election in a presidential election year. So that was really categorical. And I think you're going to see, of course, Susan Collins already is saying she has lots of concerns about it, and she's in a tight race and down by 8 or 10, 12 points.
As is Graham, by the way. Graham has a
as
real
is Graham,
yeah.
Absolutely. And then you got, and for him, it's going to be, do I turn out my Republican voters? And then,
which seems to be McConnell's calculation in his race is, I'm just going to go full team, and I'm in a red state. I'm gonna stand by the president. I'm gonna ride his coattails.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and then Murkowski has already said she will not. And then I think the interesting question will be: will some of these senators who decided they're not going to run again because they so can't stand the tenor of the Senate, are they going to have gumption enough? I was going to use another word, but gumption will have to satisfy here to man up and not do it and not support Trump on this one. But we'll see, and I think ideally they would wait at least till after the election. But politically, they're not going to do that. This is the issue that is this issue will change the outcome of the election. And I know both parties are aware of that, and I know both candidates are aware of that. And although people are voting now, but as you and I both point out, some of us may wait to see how we do our absentee until the end. So it's going to be interesting.
Who didn't want the Kavanaugh hearings on PCP right before an election? This is going to be awful.
It's going to be terrible. Well, it'll be, if you're a political junkie, it's going to be red meat on both sides.
I feel sorry for so many people suffering through 2020 because there are many horrible things. I've never had more fun.
It's terrible.
I know it's a horrible thing to say, but it's been interesting.
And of course, I'm living in a county down here on the rural southeastern Virginia shore on the Chesapeake Bay, and I have seen 2 Biden signs and probably dozens and tens of dozens of huge Trump signs.
Yeah.
Although I saw one, I love this one with the big streak of yellow hair flowing, and it says BUYDON.
Everybody talks about these secret Trump voters and polling, and there's some evidence because of the differential between right track, wrong track versus, Biden versus Trump. But I've never seen a group of people who are more proud and more. It's like CrossFitters. Like, somebody's a Trump fan because they tell you in the first 5 minutes, like, the secret is probably more secret bite. The Dispatch and the Bulwark crowd, and their sensibilities are more secret Biden voter. So Bob Barr, Reinhold on our network keeps talking about Bob Barr, and he's uniquely awful. And you sent a story along that line, and I will put all the articles that Rob sent me. I'll put them in the show notes so you can grab them and see all the stuff that.
By the way, Bob Barr is the bad boy. This is Bill Barr.
Bill Barr. Yep. Sorry.
He's a different kind of bad boy.
Yep. So Bob Barr, William P. Barr, Bill Barr. Excuse me. I'll call him William. William Barr's attack on his own prosecutors, fed by frustration with both sides of political aisle, people who know him say. The typical whataboutism, which is an abandonment of principle, to be honest, is, well, Eric Holder was the wingman for Obama. Why can't Bill Barr, be the wingman for Donald Trump? What is so uniquely problematic about the Attorney General?
Well, I think, part of all of this is the challenging of norms, political norms. NATO, that's a norm now after 70 years. Various treaties, how senators, the filibuster, all of these things are norms that develop over time. And I find it interesting and ironic that so many supposed conservatives are happy to challenge them. And this is kind of this whole conversation around the swamp. What Barr actually said, and it was to a group of conservatives, was that some prosecutors were headhunters, which happens to be true, and that career staff, rather than being best suited to make decisions in sensitive cases, needed to defer to him. He is the top law enforcement official. That is true, but by deferring, others are accusing him of politics and his decisions, as if politics doesn't already exist in law. And as the paper says, he decried what he called the criminalization of politics and the lust among some media and others to criminally charge officials with whom they disagree. And of course, we all remember lock her up, lock her up. Who was the guy saying lock her up? Well, it was his boss. But I do think, we're saying I occasionally get to sit in on a group at the Niskanen Center, which is a spin out of the Cato. And Bill Niskanen was a great, wonderful economist. And we've talked about him before, one of George Bush Sr.'s advisors. And he, anyway, so they have a group so it's really sort of never Trumpers. And I love it. And I love the guy running it. But, there's a lot of discussion in that group and others about will he be charged? And there was an article today, will Trump be charged with some violations? I mean, I think that's a legitimate question. Will the New York State drop its lawsuits if he loses? Will they just all of these charges by women disappear. We have another one from 25 years ago. I'm kind of a give me a break kind of school on a lot of stuff, as bad as it might be, particularly since you can't prove it with any certainty in these days. But so Barr, in every respect, was right about some aspects of the swamp that are true.
Yeah, one that stood out.
Criminalized politics now, and I think about years ago I worked for Ken Lay and Enron, and I didn't work for Enron, but in graduate school between my first and second year at Yale, I went back to work in Florida Gas, which is one of the bigger companies in Orlando, where I had grown up, and I had sent a letter out of the blue, and Ken Lay, who was then president of Florida Gas, hired me for the summer, and we became friends. And I followed him when he went out to Texas, and he and Selby Sullivan, who was then the CEO, did a number of acquisitions and kind of rebuilt the company. And Ken, who was a brilliant economist, he basically built the natural gas market, and some would say Potemkin's village, but Enron really was a totally financially driven company. And and when all this stuff, the scandal happened, it was Andy Fastow and these guys who really ran it, and these guys got off. But the prosecutors really wanted Ken's scalp. It was about a big scalp. And, Giuliani was that way when he was running, and maybe some of these guys deserve to be it. But
it's Chris Christie, which is why Kushner forced him out as transition chief, because he held a
Absolutely.
grudge over locking his dad up.
Yeah, as a scalp. Yeah. So there's no question prosecutors, many have political ambitions.
Look at Preet Bharara and his. If you listen to Preet Bharara's podcast, he's the first guy that got basically. I think he was in New York, and he got fired by Trump. Yeah. It's a lot of what Trump does is he forces people to drop the pretense.
Yeah.
Like, okay, you're gonna.
Sometimes that's good. Sometimes that's bad.
Yeah, right. Like, all right, we're gonna just immediately. We're not even going to worry about like honoring our BG's legacy. We're just going to go right to the politics, like everybody, little things like that to the big things like the Justice Department and that sense of fairness and neutrality is mostly BS, and that's part of what he said is like, these prosecutors are some of the most political people. Our current mayor in Indianapolis used that office of a federal prosecutor to be elected mayor.
Well, we have a vice presidential candidate on the Democratic ticket who was a prosecutor and prosecuted crime in order to get reelected. And now, of course, that has come back to bite her a little bit. But because she is who she is, and on that ticket, she gets a bit of a pass. So, I mean, everything he said was true. And there are an awful lot of people who know, those who know, who do BDO, that kind of thing. Those who know right. It's all true. And it's just the way it is. But, I do think there is a thin veneer, something you alluded to a minute ago, between civilization and the jungle.
Yes.
And a lot of that veneer is people being willing to, as Bader-Ginsburg said, have a little bit of a loss of hearing to things that are disturbing and or a process that looks fair, or a pretense of civility. And
there's
goes a long ways.
Like that. And I wrote an article for We Are Libertarians, kind of talking about why I stopped giving Trump the benefit of the doubt. And the reality is that a lot of the stuff that he is against is right. Like, yes, there is liberal bias in the media, but there's matters of degree, right? Michael Malice is a commentator that has this great saying: "Take one red pill, not the whole bottle." It's
right.
like there's
it's great.
There's a quick slope from there's liberal bias to I'm not reading anything, and now I'm subject to right leaning propaganda. Like there is an establishment and a swamp that is problematic, but that can also be a slippery slope to believing in QAnon. There's a point where a lot of us just hop off that train to QAnonville because we go, yeah, you're right about this, but you're taking it too far. And 2020 has really it's accelerated that to such a pace. And then I don't think people really appreciate on the right how far right they've gone. and maybe it's the same on the left. It's just I'm a creature of the right, and I see people that said reasonable things a year ago saying unreasonable, awful things now, and I'm like, that was a pretty quick hop, right?
Well, so some of that's not necessarily right or left. Some of it is way down low,
right,
or in outer space,
right.
And and the whole thing around vaccines. We have the conversations around the COVID vaccine and whether people will trust it or not. I personally have already signed up for a trial. I haven't been told I get to do it, but I would do it in a second. Because I trust the professionals in that business, the swamp, if you will,
right?
Who are making these companies, and they know that they're vulnerable to lawsuits and everything. So I trust that. So
I am on the opposite. I'm on the opposite end of that. It doesn't mean I'm an anti-vaxxer.
But it doesn't mean you're anti-vaxxer.
Exactly right. Yeah. But when the people that brought you Iraq and Vietnam come out and say we'll have a vaccine by election day, I go, I'm not going first.
Well, I'm sort of the view. I am a little bit of the view that if someone else had said it, they would be applauded, and it's just how they say it, and even there was an interesting analysis, for example, of Trump, and I don't believe it. It's a fraud, not fake kind of thing on the discussion of COVID. And he, the Post actually awarded 2 Pinocchios to the Biden people because they're using Trump called the virus a fake, yet he told the reporter that in rage that he knew all about it and it was terrible. And in fact, he didn't say that. What he said was the brouhaha the Democrats were cooking up at that point was fake.
Right.
And I think that's true of a lot of so-called fake news. It's why the hell is it news? It is fake that it is news, but it's not that it's real or not real. But like the vaxxers, is that right or left that they don't believe?
Yeah, no, that's not. It started on the left and it's on the right, and it's kind of a bottom. If you will.
It's crazy. It's not right or left, in my opinion. I was at a restaurant last night. We don't go to a lot, but we went to the local little seafood grill on the end of the island here, and I love the grill and the people, and the owner is quirky and we like him, but I mean he's the only guy in there not wearing a mask. And I said, "Why aren't you wearing a mask?" And he said, "I don't believe it." Said, what don't you believe? Right. I mean, he says the virus it's not bad. It's not going to do anything. And I said, "Well, it's killed a lot of people." And he said, "Wow." That was sort of like what the hell don't you believe?
You could look at that in April and go, and I said this to a lot of people that I talked to, like, okay, it's not an unreasonable expectation in March or April to say, I don't believe this, but it's going to be a much harder position to hold in April of 2021 when 500,000 people are dead. At what point don't you just eat crow and go, I got this wrong? There's, I don't get it. But
I think a lot of people were we're not, so, my wife and I have talked about the fact we both believed it was a, clear issue, but we both thought it would be over by mid-May. And of course, here we are. We started this in early March when it was cold, and I've got my second cold day here. It's 60 degrees, and I'm freezing my butt off because I'm a Floridian still after 50 years. And so the winter is upon us again. And, I think we're going to have this. We're going to be dealing with it through probably next summer.
What do you make of the Bob Woodward book, briefly, before we move on to Princeton?
I am always astonished, and I'll be damned if I know I am, at what would drive anyone to talk to Bob Woodward, knowing what he's going to do to him. And the only thing I can say is it is Trump's massive ego that somehow he is going to be able to, I think he knows that Woodward is writing history. And of course he wants to be written about in history. And so I just think he is convinced that he can beat him at their game.
Yeah.
But I do think Woodward is so good at the interviews. He does insinuate that he's talking to you off the record. And I didn't say that, of course, but he's just a pal, and he sort of counsels you at the same time. Now, I will say, all this crap about Woodward supposedly should have revealed what he had read or heard from Trump before.
It's hindsight bias. He didn't know at the time.
Yeah,
he didn't know at the time what it was going to be.
And I'm not even sure that he's revealing anything that anybody didn't know.
Right.
I think it is arguable, and Trump is inarticulate at best at expressing himself and what he may mean. It is arguable that downplaying some of this in terms of panic is not necessarily bad or good. I'm not going to make a judgment, but I can understand that people didn't want to panic people. And you certainly could argue that Fauci and the CDC and others didn't want to early and did not understand the severity of it. And of course, they also thought they were in better position than they were. CDC, that's appalling. The CDC failures really are appalling early on. And that is something that's been going since the end of the second Bush administration. And they basically used up the supplies and everything else, and they never really replenished all that. And then they had a very flawed testing process, and they had to destroy all of the test kits that they produced under their standards, and they wouldn't let anybody else do it because they didn't believe anybody else could adhere to the proper standards. So,
which is the real scandal, is that if everybody kind of in the government sort of knew, like everybody goes, oh, well, he knew and he didn't inform us, which is like saying a hurricane's coming, but we're not going to tell you how bad it's going to be. Okay, right. I get that. But like, if you're president and you are in charge of the HHS, CDC, FDA, and you're telling a reporter that you think that this is going to be catastrophic, why are and you're a free market guy, supposedly, why are you not picking up the phone to make sure that the CDC is decentralizing testing so there isn't one single point of success or failure? That, to me, is the single greatest mistake of the Trump administration, because it cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Germany has only lost 10,000, it's a terrible way to phrase it, but Germany has lost less than 10,000 people because they were on top of testing. They provided us a test. We were not.
Although they have become hotspots again.
Sure.
Germany, Spain, France, they're all becoming hotspots again, as is Korea. And I think that just shows the resilience of this virus.
It's there, but
the resilience of human misbehavior.
Yeah, but not... That misbehavior would be curtailed if people had the proper information to govern their behavior. And
I don't think so. I really disagree with that. I think people have had for quite some time enough information to know that they shouldn't be wandering around in big crowds with people without masks. These are people who make judgments way beyond reason. It has nothing. That's a political statement by these idiots, and in my mind, they are idiots. You can push back here and push back there, but they're idiots, and they've got plenty of data and plenty of information. No, it's highly contagious. So, but I want to push you on another thing about CDC. So, not to excuse any of this. Mm-hmm. So, there have been a lot of people who knew that the CDC did not have, the PPEs, and I don't know that they knew or had anything about the process of producing the test kits, but you want hearings on that stuff. This is why you do have hearings. And once this is all over, and you like them to be nonpartisan, which means it probably shouldn't be the Congress. Although, you want some appointees from there to a commission, but like 9/11 commission or something.
Right.
But what people, presidents, like everyone, often find out the facts after the facts have bit them on the butt. Mm. So, presidents are sitting there thinking about foreign policy, and in particular about Russia and China, not about Ethiopia this week, or Croatia, and they're thinking about interest rates in the economy and the budget and the deficits, but they're not thinking about how much CDC gets or what the last CDC report said, because the government is huge. We have 2 million people or so somehow working with or around the government, both from the private sector and the public. And people in these programs half the time don't know what's going on themselves. So what you want, and this is his failing, what you want is the ability to get all this stuff to people who are qualified to look at it and make decisions, who are knowledgeable enough that they can do it for you. You can only govern, you can only manage a half a dozen to a dozen people at best. And And he is a guy who's put a hand on management, for a small company that had maybe 70 employees, and he relied on 3 or 4 people, and which is sort of the right structure. And now he's got a government with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in these agencies, and I don't know how many spots are still open, but I would not be surprised if there were 200 spots still open, people to run the agencies. And they just finally got an nominated the Homeland Security guy, which arguably is one of the 3 or 4 most important cabinet secretaries in our country, in our government. So that is his big failure. His failure is to understand that he has a job of managing the government. And some people will say, thank God, because, a lot of stuff he wanted to do did not and will not get done because he doesn't have people in place there to do it or who know how to do it properly. And others later, when they stand back and think about it, will realize he didn't get something done because, or he just didn't have the right people in the right spot. So some people will be glad he didn't, and some people will be sorry he didn't.
Yeah,
I'm sort of in the happy he didn't.
I am too, and I read the book The Fifth Risk by Michael Lewis, and I realize how many different things the federal government currently does that are important. That ongoing lack of attention and I'm not a collapsitarian, as they're called. I believe that stability is good for the development and proselytizing of liberty, for the lack of a better term, is better when people aren't worried about their pocketbooks and their bellies. You can convince people when they're less emotional. And what Trump does is he makes people emotional. He keeps them off balance and anxious, and that's typically what big government people want to do instead of rationalizing with you. And the way to decrease the size of the federal government is not the way that he's doing it, and it's actually pretty harmful to the country in how we're supposedly achieving liberty. You can't.
You and I've talked before. He sort of lets the swamp run in so many ways. He's not the guy draining the swamp, and now he's creating his own swamp creatures.
But to your point, I've heard this said about Bush, George W., and Bill Clinton. They were the more effective presidents were governors because they had to manage a bureaucracy before, and less effective are the senators who just talked. This is, supposedly, I've always heard my whole life, government should be run like business. Well, it's not working out well.
Well, it shouldn't be, in fact, because businesses are supposed to have bottom lines.
Yeah.
And the bottom line for government is delivery of services, whether it's defense or healthcare or whatever else. And some of those things you just have to deliver, full speed ahead, no matter the cost. Although that doesn't mean so. I always find people who say that don't know much about government or business.
I think we're getting a preview of his second term because all the adults are gone. Anything that libertarians or Republicans liked happened in the first 2 years when the adults who understood these systems were around. And now that those people are gone, if McConnell's gone, then he has nobody to stop him on any of the worst impulses. He's only got sycophants around him. You saw that in the HHS communications guy that got fired this week, who went on Facebook Live and started saying a bunch of crazy stuff. Like, that guy was a political appointee to he's the
he took sick leave.
Yeah, he was like the spokesperson for the CDC, and he was saying the most crazy QAnon stuff and like that, but he was there because he was loyal to the president. Like, that's sort of a preview of a second term, should it happen, or the end of the first term. And I think what you'll see with the Trump second term is he's rolling out all these executive orders, turning in his homework last minute before the papers due on November 5th. And you may see a more predatory government towards the left. At least that's how I interpreted the Princeton story that you want to share. Can you tell us?
Oh, yeah, that one's so interesting. Well,
Can you share what's happening with the education department launching an investigation into Princeton?
Yeah, not to be I don't have all the details, of course, but the headline essentially is that Princeton is being charged by the Department of Education with civil rights violations because they have themselves said they were guilty of systemic racism. And, everybody is running around accusing themselves of systemic racism these days. And, I think we probably all know that there are aspects of society which the effect of which has a systematic effect. And you could call that systemic racism. I don't think everybody is, and I don't think everything is. Some things are accidental, but some things are deliberate, like the way the New York state property taxes and stuff, which we've talked about before, which were deliberately higher in black neighborhoods. But so this is a little bit of hoisting on your own petard. So the education department, which is beat up all the time about not pressing civil rights charges and activities, and I suspect they are not as tough on that as they might have been under Obama and some others before, has turned around and bitten Princeton, which acknowledges that it's guilty of systemic racism, and charging them with civil rights violations. And I think that is so beautiful.
But who is being discriminated against, Rob? That's the twist in all this.
Well, they would say that the discrimination is against blacks, and that certainly was the intent of the law, is to undo racial discrimination. But anyway, I just think it's delicious. I hate that's where that term applies there. It is a case of being hoisted on your own petard. And of course, now they view it as harassment. Whereas if it were some other university, they'd think it was terrific.
So based on letters sent to Princeton on Wednesday from Robert King, Assistant Secretary in the Office of the Post-Secondary Education, they received $75 million in taxpayer funds, and so that's why they're being.
That's why they have say.
Right. And so based on its admitted racism, he says, the department was concerned that the school's non-discrimination and equal opportunity assurances, quote, from at least 2013 to the present may have been false. And after Princeton announced after an August meeting, Isa Gruber announced these efforts would continue this year and beyond, identifying priorities such as assembling a faculty that more closely mirrors the diversity of its students, addressing names and iconography on campus, and reviewing the university's benefits with an eye towards enhancing equality. And so basically they're taking the far left's cries of "you're not racially diverse enough" and trying to defund the university. I don't know if they'll win on this one or not. It will depend on what kind of judge gets to see it. So anyway, but it's amusing in that you have the two sides being driven to the height of absurdity. And unfortunately, I think we have all been driven to the height of absurdity by this administration, this president, and the political campaign. And there is more to come. And I can't say that this week. I know you and I are running out of time here, but I think I would say until yesterday, the news has generally been less and less. I'd say generally less favorable for Trump, although I think the numbers are certainly narrowing among likely voters between the two sides. There's still large numbers around saying that they are undecided. Earlier, I think late last week or early this week, Wisconsin and Minnesota came in. There were two polls out of there that were likely voters, and Wisconsin, if I recall, was very close and really a toss-up, and which was a surprise to a lot of people based on the police activities there and the riots and all that. And Minnesota was a little more for Biden, which would be disappointing to Trump. But I would say the Justice Ginsburg's death is going to upend all of that. So it's like
I'm not going to make any predictions for about weeks.
Yeah, it's like it's like BC AD. Everything before this and everything after this. It's much more significant in my mind that like Trump had 2 mandates: don't be Hillary Clinton and appoint conservative justices to the Supreme Court.
That's
and
right.
Anybody who was center right, I mean, Jorgensen probably got gutted by 50% of her vote. People are going to go, well, I don't like this guy, but I can't from my Bushy days, I remember how central the court was to the Republican mindset, because that is where the culture war is fought. And Roe v. Wade set out on the right this mentality of we've got to win at all costs in the court. And that didn't change over the last 4 years, And so people are going to go, I'm going to stomach and vote for him because I can't afford the leftist takeover the court, despite the fact that this was a leftist justice that Biden would probably just remain a 5-4 conservative-leaning majority. But the eagerness for 6-3 is there, and it's going to be a powerful thing on the right. It's going to be a powerful thing on the left, and it's
well.
Totally
if you look at the numbers though from the last election. The Trump voters turned out in pretty good numbers. And so the people who sat home were not on the Republican side, by and large, in 2016. People who sat out on the side were on the Democrat side. And so I think I think if the Democrats can turn out the base and use this to do that, it is a very esoteric thing, though. The reality is fewer people actually care about Roe v. Wade per se, or even know what it was.
Mm-hmm.
You would be astonished at the number of young women and young people who don't know that their right to choose is dependent on that law. And so, there's kind of a swift education campaign here, and I think they're going to have to be very sophisticated about how they pose this to potential voters who may not have shown up last time. So in the end, I think it will probably benefit. It probably will benefit Biden more. And then, of course, there's the other aspect. If we don't have a judge by Election Day, we will have only 8 people on the court deciding all of these state-by-state issues coming along, which we know will happen, as you mentioned, however many hundreds of lawyers in Florida already. And so, you have to hope that the numbers are decisive enough that even after a week or 2 or 3 weeks, the court keeps its cool.
I'm not going to get anything I want out of this presidential election. All I want is just a decisive election night victory, so we can move on, like one way or the other.
Going to be. You're not going to get that.
No, I know I'm not.
Decisive election night victory.
And Trump steps on it, so he's going to end up messing around. They're going to lose the Senate, and then he'll win, and then there won't be an appointment and you'll have 4-4 for the rest of the Trump presidency, because
totally.
It'll be wild. So all right, well we are out of time. Rob, thank you so much. Great conversation as always.
You didn't mention food.
You're right. The Diner's Guide to DC. We've got to talk about that.
Well, I will talk about a little of that and the other, but I was up there last week and for a couple of days, and I will say it's just incredibly deserted, and I am sad at the number of restaurants that have closed.
Yeah.
So I didn't go to any place new, so I won't review that, but I will just say it's a turn of season. And as everybody knows, I am a really good cook, and my son is a chef, and I'm going to take a little credit for that. And so, I was thinking about, I've been eating crabs like crazy. I get, between 8 and a dozen every single day, and I let them build up for a couple of days. I've been eating them like crazy, but the weather has changed. I'm catching fish in my crab trap. I'm catching red drum. They find their way in, so I don't even have to fish.
Nice.
But I've decided the winter is nigh, and I'm going to cook a brisket tonight.
Excellent.
And some kind of really good pasta. And the Washington Post today had their 10 favorite recipes of the last year, one of which was a chocolate cream pie.
Oh.
So, Chris, if you were down here with me, you could be having a really cool roast brisket and a fabulous chocolate cream pie.
I'm very jealous. I am.
And maybe I'll take a picture for our viewers.
Please do. I will post it. Yeah, I will be having my typical microwavable Swanson's protein
don't do that.
blend. Yes. Eat my vegetables.
No, well, I'd had a great discovery. My last word on microwavable. So, when I'm in D.C., we have a little apartment. I was going to make breakfast, and I thought, no, I'll go down to the coffee shop. And it turns out their microwave wasn't working, so they couldn't nuke their green chilies and eggs, whatever it was. And I went over to the grocery, and Jimmy Dean now has a breadless, carbless, or low-carb breakfast sandwich, and it is made with egg frittatas as the bun, and then the sausage and cheese and whatever else. But that's pretty clever. The things that they're doing for these Gen Zers and millennials like you are really cool.
Yeah, so
I kind of miss things by cooking for myself.
I cook and I enjoy cooking. Sometimes you don't get the time, and there is Swanson has great microwavable vegetable packs, and one of them is a Southwestern protein blend that I eat a lot. It's it's my version of healthy. Throw a little hot sauce on there. It's really good.
Yeah, that's great. All right. Well, it's been great to chat today, and we have a lot to talk about as we move forward.
Yeah, we'll definitely do one before the election day. Right after the debates. The debates are.
Yeah, I can't wait.
Maybe that's the only thing that might change the race here.
Well, I'm hoping that Trump does his usual number and Biden looks at him and says, "You're an idiot," and walks off.
Listen, they've set the
That's
bar.
what I would do.
They've set the bar so low for Joe Biden that as long as he doesn't come out and drool on himself, he's probably going to win the debate. But if he does, it may be over. So,
I wouldn't debate Trump.
Yeah.
All righty.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for listening to We Are Libertarians. If you love the show, please share it, and we'll see you again next week.
5 people.